All right, so New York Times did an article about Bernie Sanders. Anybody want to guess if it was positive or negative? Do 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 do. Yeah, it's never positive. Was it negative? Of course, it was negative, of course. But that's not the interesting part. Every article in the mainstream media is negative about Bernie Sanders, and especially the New York Times, which has pretty much, it appears, a loathing of Bernie Sanders. So the feeling is beginning to be mutual for progressives' feelings about the New York Times. No, the interesting part is the assumptions and the framing of the article, because they blame him for all these things. It's a deeply negative article. But the things they're blaming him for are borderline hilarious. I mean, their bias is so thick, so obvious, so preposterous, that it's amazing and kind of funny that they can't see it. So what's their critique of Bernie Sanders? They're like, well, we looked through his old papers when he was mayor, and he cared a lot about foreign policy. And, okay, well, we move on. Apparently that's a bad thing for a mayor to be a worldly person. You should only care about the plumbing in your town and not care about anything else in the world. Okay. All right. Let's keep moving, though. So what did he say about foreign policy? The main thing they focused on was Nicaragua. And he did not agree with the death squads we had used in the form of the Contras. Oh my God, I'm scandalized. He was not pro-death squads? Oh, outrageous. Well, obviously he can't be president if you're not going to agree with right-wing death squads. I mean, they say it with a straight face. They had an so-called expert that they framed as almost neutral. Like, they quoted that he was with the Reagan administration, but they framed it like, oh, he's giving an expert analysis of what Bernie thought. And the guy who was in favor of the death squads from the Reagan administration chastised Bernie for not being in favor of them. Wow, that is quite surprising that the people he was criticizing the Reagan administration for the butchery that they were in favor of, turns out they don't agree with Bernie Sanders. The New York Times prints it like, well, then I guess they're right. I mean, this is a real critique of Bernie Sanders. I mean, I guess I can't love a critique more than he's not pro-death squads. So they're like, but he went down to Nicaragua once, and there was a protest, and there was an anti-American chant that he didn't hear, but was at the same protest as Bernie Sanders. Yeah, do you know why they were doing anti-American chants? Because America was financing death squads in their country. That would be a good reason to do an anti-American chant. Did Bernie Sanders participate? Did he say, hey, death to the Yankee? No, of course not. You don't have that. But you wrote the article anyway. You have nothing damaging, but you wrote it anyway. And why? Because you got to attack Bernie Sanders. And pro-war and pro-establishment is the bias that the New York Times finds to be not biased. Well, that's the view from nowhere, as Jay Rosen at NYU would say. My perspective is not a perspective at all, the New York Times thinks. The establishment is correct. The status quo is wonderful. Anyone who doesn't disagree is biased. Whereas I am not biased because I loved all those wars, and I'm now writing an article completely critical of Bernie Sanders, saying they're not sure that the Democratic Party is ready for someone who's what? Anti-Contra from the 1980s? You wrote that with a straight face. And they say, well, he also went to the Soviet Union once. Okay, why did he go to the Soviet Union? That's interesting, right? Like, if he went there and said, comrades, it is time for an uprising, I'd say, oh, well, I didn't know that, right? He went there because he didn't want a nuclear war started with the Soviet Union. Well, there you go. Guilty again. New York Times thinks that this is something that should count against them in the primaries. They wrote a gigantic article with like, I don't know if he's in the primaries, but I don't know if this is going to sit well with the Democratic Party. This guy was against nuclear war. To be fair to the New York Times, it might not sit well with the current Democratic leadership. And then when we say we're dissatisfied with that Democratic establishment, they go, why? I don't understand. Are progressives really supposed to be pro-nuclear war? I mean, it's like Bill Kristol wrote that article or John Bolton wrote that article. It's amazing that they cannot see their own bias. How could they read that article? The people who wrote it, the editors, everyone else at the company, ombudsman, looks at it and goes, no, this is not bias against progressives. It's just smearing the top progressive candidate for being anti-war, which is only the most logical thing that anybody's ever heard in their life, which then leads later to Chuck Todd asking Bernie Sanders about how are you going to respond to these hammer and sickle attacks against you. Well, you guys, the mainstream media, are the only ones doing the hammer and sickle attacks. There are no actual voters who are like, I can't believe he didn't want nuclear war or was against the death squads. And then they say, oh, and he also went to Cuba and talked about how they have good health care. But they do have good health care. They're a mess in every other way, which Bernie acknowledges, but they do have a decent education and health care system, right? So apparently you're not allowed to tell the truth about Cuba, both the upsides and the downsides. You only have to yell at them, okay? That's the only thing that's allowed by the New York Times. The paper of record, these guys think that they're challenging the government. The only people they're challenging is progressives because of their deep, deep disdain and bias against progressives. They are allowed to attack progressives day in, day out, but no progressive is ever allowed to actually publish anything there, never allowed to have their opinions there. No, progressives are, no, right-wing. They could yell at the New York Times all day long. They could say New York Times is the enemy of the people, and the New York Times, they could imply that the New York Times should be attacked, and the New York Times kisses their ass and says, how many right-wingers can I put on? I want to put it on the editorial page. I want to frame everything from their perspective. So the establishment is awesome. The right wing must be appeased, but progressives are to be spit upon and attacked in every conceivable way. Only once in the article, in literally half a sentence, do they acknowledge, well, in El Salvador, where he was also against death squads, there really were, death squads were really quite bad in El Salvador. Oh, okay, thank you. Now, they say, well, hey, you just don't like it that your candidate is being criticized. That's not true, okay? We criticize Bernie Sanders on other things when he did not have a great point on gun rights, and we've gone over it 1,000 times, and every time I talk about this, I feel like I go over the top in pointing out all the things we don't agree with Bernie Sanders on, because we're actually unbiased. Like they say, oh, you're biased against establishment candidates. Biased what? Like Buttigieg. What do I know about Buttigieg? I don't know anything about him. I was looking forward. I had heard positive things about him about during the DNC and the questions that were surrounding how the DNC should be reframed and reconstituted. And he comes out and he's incredibly smart. So why did I now not a big fan of Buttigieg? Because he says he doesn't do policy. Well, then I don't know what I'm voting for. I don't want to vote for a guy who says, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. Then a couple of policy positions he comes out are against Medicare for all and some of the things that we believe in. So there's no bias. We actually care about the policy. I guess the New York Times thinks that if you care about policy and you're against war, you're against our offensive, outrageous wars, you're against the right wing or against the establishment, you're biased. No, that's called perspective. That's called caring about policy. Unlike you people, well, Bernie Sanders doesn't comb his hair, and Buttigieg and Beto are pretty, and they stand on tables, and golly gee, they speak Norwegian, so we'll look at superficial stuff, but when someone dares represent progressives, hatchet job after hatchet job, I cannot believe they wrote an article criticizing him and saying that he might not be right for the Democratic Party because he's against war and against death squads. Okay, what does that make the New York Times? Does it make them pro those issues? Okay, here's what we know for sure. The New York Times is establishment through and through. The media blockade of progressives continues. They say, well, you put them on your channel, Cenk. I do. You know why? You know who runs my channel? Me, okay? So I'm the only one who could break the blockade. But you guys never publish us. And almost no one is allowed on TV. And then you go, well, I don't know why you guys think we rigged the election when every single writer we had, both for the articles and for the opinion pieces, and almost everyone on television is in favor of Biden and Kamala Harris and Buttigieg and Beto, and every one of them hates Bernie Sanders. I don't know why you think we'd rig it. The Russians couldn't rig an election anywhere near as good as that. The DNC couldn't rig an election anywhere near as good as that. And then when we point out these facts to the New York Times, they will cry and say, oh my God, that sounds conspiratorial. Did you ever write a positive article about him? Okay, that's who the New York Times is. Understand that, okay? So when we get animated about it, they're going to say, how dare you? No, you attacked first, New York Times, and you did it 1,000 times. So don't pretend to have your feelings hurt when we challenge you, okay? You say, oh, only the right wing's allowed to do that, and I bow before them. But progressives, nothing but disdain. You get the sense I'm angry? Look, guys, if it isn't for us, who the hell's going to stick up for progressives? Yes, you should support us because we got your back. TYT.com/join. We got to stick together. If we don't stick together, these guys are going to pick us apart, okay? So we're here fighting for you guys and fighting for progressives, and it feels oftentimes like we're the only ones. come, we got to do this together.